IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to a rebroadcasted episode of Shunya One. We are going to revisit a conversation we had in December 2017. The conversation was with Zainab Bawa. Zainab is the CEO of HasGeek. HasGeek is one of the companies that does a lot of tech events. I think events around technology are particularly important in today's ecosystem, and I thought this was a really interesting conversation, well worth revisiting. So with that, let's get you on with the episode.
All right, welcome to Shunya One. Today we have Zainab Bawa, the CEO of HasGeek, with us. Welcome to the show, Zainab.
Thanks, Shiladitya.
Thanks so much for doing this. I'm glad I caught you on your short Bombay trip.
Yeah, it is a whirlwind trip, and I suppose whirlwind is the right word for Bombay.
Yes, especially from someone coming from Bangalore. I think that's the right way to say it, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yes, but I'm so glad you could make it here. And obviously, just to give you a little background on Zainab, Zainab is the CEO of HasGeek. She started HasGeek with Kiran way back in December 2010. And of course, I think HasGeek is a sort of a key part of the ecosystem in India today. Over the years, doing a whole bunch of events. Starting with, I think I still remember seeing you guys when you were just a job board. And I don't think the events were even around back then, but then since then HasGeek is known for events like RootConf, Meta Refresh, Fifth Elephant, JS Food, DroidCon, just to name a few. And my personal interest, of course, is still 50p, which is up and coming, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So over to you. Why don't you tell us how you got here? It's 7 years into this journey.
Yeah, and in fact, I think on the 17th of December, we're going to be celebrating our 7th anniversary. So we've been in the business for 7 years, survived it, and looking forward to probably the next 7 years.
Oh, yes. Important to note, it is a bootstrapped
It's a bootstrap company, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think now I guess every year on year when you look back, you wonder, was it really worth it to spend those sleepless nights wondering when the next burst of cash is going to come into pay salaries? But I guess it's been worth it, and it's an interesting addiction in that sense. But I guess I never really started off thinking that I'd sort of end up in this position of herding cats. I guess for those who know the parlance, geeks are sort of referred to as cats, and I usually like calling myself a cat herder. So I came from a completely different world to Bangalore in 2006, where I was kind of researching the politics of real estate in Bombay and hoping to kind of write a full ethnography of how changes in land use and whatnot was changing the face of the city. And suddenly, I'm zoom into 2010, and I'm here, thinking, oh, we're going to be starting a company now. Wow. So from a very different world of looking at how humans function in their context to suddenly sort of being situated in a context where I'm surrounded by a whole bunch of geeks who are talking about programming and who are passionate about open source and whatnot. And I think we were living in fairly interesting times between 2007 and 2010 when iOS came into the market. The Nokia phones the feature phones were starting to go on their way out, and you had Android coming in. You had the whole scene with the browsers changing, and suddenly the world of technology became very interesting. And I still remember this phrase, this vignette that someone narrated, saying that in 2011, if you were away from the web for 2 months and you were not a practicing developer, you'd really be ages behind, because technology was changing so rapidly and so fast. I think where we kind of made a very important intervention was in bringing people who were actually practicing and hands-on with this technology to come and talk to others who were trying to get onto this. So I was interestingly, I booked my show this afternoon, and I was talking to Viraj Patel, the VP of Technology, and he was saying that, back in 2014, 2015, when we came to RootConf, we heard this talk about Ansible, and we opened up our computer and decided to set up the environment there. And the night we kind of played around, and we said, boom, now Book My Show is going to be on Ansible. And suddenly I'm like, oh wow, I didn't realize we made that kind of an impact. So I guess the sort of the value addition that we brought about in the space was helping people to learn from each other's knowledge and to reduce the cost of evaluating this technology for your organization. So instead of saying that I will run this experiment in my organization for 6 months to decide whether ABC works for us or not, here we were trying to create these platforms where you could come and listen to others, their stories, their organizational war stories, and make that choice for yourself based on what somebody else was talking about from real practice. I think that's been one clear intervention. The other is the ability to bring in a neutral perspective. While we ourselves have programmers at HasGeek and we adopt and we work with certain technologies, we ourselves don't necessarily sit and advocate those technologies at our conferences. For us, the idea is that these events are the platforms for people to come and talk about approaches, and that you could be using any kind of approach because it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, what matters is how did you understand your problem, and therefore, what approach did you use? And I guess being able to kind of take that neutral position has put us in a great situation today, where people come and say, hey, listen, we value your perspective because we know that you will not be biased, or we value the fact that you bring in all these people who have their own perspectives, but you don't necessarily say that this is good or this is bad. And I think that's a very unique and a good position to be in. And the question is, how do we now continue to stay in that position, and how do we not pick winners and losers, but just continue to kind of be those facilitators?
How do you find these people in the first place, right? I mean, what goes into that? I've got to assume that's not easy.
I think, it's definitely not easy. And I guess if one were to look at the whole milieu of software developers, there are a bunch of those who kind of just sit behind computers and who are toiling away days and nights trying to respond to emergency situations because something has gone down in the organization. And those are people who will be like, oh shit, we don't want to come out and talk about our work, even though they are doing some interesting work. So we were just recollecting our own journey a couple of days ago, and we said the first set of events that we did was completely curated until we realized that, hey, you know what, we shouldn't be bringing our own bias into the picture. So that's when we created a crowdsource system, and we said anybody is free to submit a proposal as long as you're a hands-on practitioner, as long as you're going to be advocating open source technology and you're not going to come here to make a pitch. And doing that for 7 years has been a process of filtering those who've been sort of appearing to do that work, and also going out ourselves and trying to discover these people. So it's been a process of crowdsourcing, discovery, and in the process, I think what has been interesting is also the kind of people that we deal with. People who are passionate about open source technology, who want to talk about their work, people who've gone through various journeys. Like the other day I was talking to someone who said, I started out as being a mechanical engineer. Then I got hired as a data engineer. And for 3 years I did data engineering. And then I started dabbling around and playing with the data problems of all these companies I worked at. And the next thing I knew was I was on my way to becoming a data scientist. And at the end of all of this, he was like, what is so great for me to come out and speak in your forum, because by speaking, what I get is feedback from others on my knowledge and these kind of input. So I think what has sort of happened as a result of kind of trying to do this facilitation is people coming out and sharing some of these things for their own reputation, or for the process of building community, or for the process of peer feedback. And I think this has been quite valuable in that sense. It's been a difficult journey because it's always this process of how do you help people shape and fine-tune their insights. But I think now when we look back at the end of 7 years, I mean, we could just call ourselves these coaches who've managed to get these 1,400 people up on stage.
So one of the so you mentioned that you want to try and keep it a certain degree of neutrality, right? One of the things that I've always found with a lot of technologists, especially open source practitioners, right? They become advocates for what they do. So how do you kind of how does that work in the context of what?
So what we tell people, you should come in with a strong opinion. You should wear your opinion on the sleeve, and let there be a debate. And so we put people in the rooms and hoped and prayed that there's not going to be a bloodbath. But the idea is wear your opinion on the sleeve, and why don't people come together and just debate about things? And I think that kind of healthy debate is what is extremely critical in any kind of ecosystem. And I think this is what we're missing currently, even in our policy circles, unfortunately.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, and in terms of, you mentioned policy circles, but the programmer ecosystem itself is, like you said, right? People have really strong opinions, especially because the one point you mentioned was the kind of people who come in and speak are typically, they may not be fundamentally trained on the subject, right? Especially with open source, most people are self-taught. They have to rough it out and understand how these platforms work, and the experience they have is personally, it's a very involved experience to getting so hands-on with technologies. And at the caliber in which the kind of people who come on shows at HasGeek, I mean, since you have a process of ensuring that there's a high quality conversation, I'm sure the opinions are flared. So
I remember back like when I used to do development, web development stuff, .NET versus PHP, man, people want to kill each other. And I mean, like, that's not even open source versus open source, which is even like, even like nobody's really like, trying to defend Microsoft with like deep passion or anything like that. But open source versus open source is like probably even tougher to deal with.
There's something versus something all
Everywhere.
the time.
Yeah, Android, iOS. Let's not talk about that.
No, that's too mainstream.
Yeah.
Okay. Come on, Android iOS is just too mainstream. Those are for people who are like, people who own devices.
What is going on right now? Ruby versus what? Ruby's fighting something, right?
Ruby's always fighting something.
Yeah, there's another.
Mongo versus MySQL.
There you go.
That is a fun debate of the ages.
Yes.
But the whole, I think the fact that, you've been pulling this off for all these years and effectively, because there's a great big cohort of people, I think, who also come back a lot. It's a very focused audience. I want to talk about, since when you conceptualize this, obviously, right? And even back to the job board days, the job board is still there. How, beyond the fact that it could have been just conversations on a digital platform, what do you see the value in doing these things on ground? Because with that, there comes a big, like you said, right? Yeah. It's a huge cost. It's infrastructure. It's organization. It's event management at a whole different scale.
Absolutely.
So you choose to take that on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you actually asked this question because, in a day and age when this whole hype about scale, the point people say is, after 7 years, you've had 15,000 people going through this experience, and we're like, yeah. But I think when we started,
no one talks in thousands.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a sort of a telling remark, especially if one were to think about the whole ecosystem in the sense of like talent development and skill development and hiring. But that's another conversation to have. But back in 2010, I guess what we kind of felt was that for any community, the act of physically coming together once a year is something that keeps them going. And it's also something that they look forward to. And I think all of us recognize this in one form or another. And this is not just restricted to technology. So, for instance, there's a phenomenon right now in Bangalore where people are going on outdoor camps. And then you kind of look forward month on month to kind of like come back together. And you have people coming back and new people joining in and old people, either coming back or not coming back. But our realization was that that a physical event is extremely important for the community to come together. Now, how do you continue the conversation outside is a different question. Also, when we started off, there was this whole trend of like mailing lists and groups. And I think as we kind of moved on, there were like Facebook groups and whatnot. And we realized that at the end of the day, what matters and what keeps a group together is the conversation. And if on an online platform there's nothing to seed the conversation or there's no moderator to kind of keep the conversation going, the question is what continues, why do people talk to each other, or what gets them to talk to each other. So for us it was important that we do this as a repeatable exercise in an effort to kind of build even that core group of people. Mm-hmm. And I think when we look back 7 years down the line, we recognize that this has been a very important exercise for us because what have we gotten out of it? One is we've gotten this whole pool of people who are now aspiring to speak. So year on year, we find that many people from the audience will come and say, hey, listen, we also want to get up on stage. Now, the question of whether they actually make it or not is the process of elimination and filtration. We have people who come up and say, hey, you talked about this year. We think this is up and coming. Why don't you talk about it? So the community has now become the source of intelligence for us because internally, I'm not a data scientist. I'm not a back-end developer. And while we do have these people within HasGeek, They're not necessarily the ones who are kind of saying, okay, this year we're going to have the conversation around this, or this year we're going to have a discussion around this. So we find that this whole act of bringing people together and doing this regularly has also now become the source of kind of wisdom and knowledge for us. So that's also been our source of market intelligence.
Of course.
And what we also wanted to kind of do, and this is something that we recognized fairly recently, was that what we've been doing differently is producing these activity forums that enable people to come together, whether it's a conference or a hack night or a workshop, and that allows us to kind of understand the very people in this ecosystem in a far richer manner than if you were to just say, I'm going to look at this person's GitHub profile, or I'm going to go and look at this person's Twitter account, or whatever digital identity source that may be. By actually interacting with these people in an actual setting, the kind of nuances that we kind of get out of how we see the ecosystem shaping, how we see the industry shaping, and how we see individual aspirations shaping in different domains, it's incredibly rich at this point in time.
In fact, so most people associate events with networking, right? I mean, it ends up being business. People are out there obviously to learn, but a large segment of those folks are out there to do business. But I think what you've been able to do, the appeal of every single HasGeek conference, because it's so focused on a particular domain, is that it gets a lot of these audiences who are very genuinely there to learn and learn off of each other, rather than just I don't think there's any very limited selling, if at all, which happens.
And I think just the journey of getting all these collaborators on board has been incredibly rich for us. And now what we are sort of recognizing is that we're literally living in two worlds of technology. We're living in a world of technology between, say, 2010 until now, where people have gone, where there have been startups, where there's been massive adoption of everything from JavaScript to Apache Spark to all that you call modern technology. And then you have those who've kind of been around in terms of giant organizations and who had older systems. And now it's a matter of how are these worlds going to come together, or how are these worlds going to interact, and who's giving us that sort of intelligence about these worlds. It's literally the people that we've been talking to.
Yeah, in fact, I was speaking to someone, we are all old world people here, because we started on things like .NET, which you just mentioned, right? I mean, or even before that. And I have a few friends from college who went out and got jobs, got placed, this 2005 and all. They were working on mainframes and COBOL and things like this, which don't exist. Of course,
2005?
Yeah, 2005 still had COBOL and mainframe jobs.
Can I say this? My father used to work on COBOL.
But hey, someone has to maintain those things.
My father passed away in 1981. And he used to work on COBOL.
So the point is, the rate of growth, which Zainab just mentioned, right? So the rate of growth has been much higher in the last few years, starting those early years of 2007, 8, 9, whenever all this happened, when the information decimation of information became much larger, right? So people could learn to code from wherever they were and so on. But yeah, there were COBOL jobs. And
I remember COBOL.
I joked saying that the only thing you are useful for today is that if one day there is a computer or a mainframe somewhere, which is if you don't know how to shut it down, it is going to end the world. That's when you're going to be useful.
I remember hearing COBOL jokes when I started college in 92. That people are still working on COBOL.
Yeah.
So 2005 is 13 years after that. That's crazy. All right. I'm sorry. That just kind of blew my mind.
But yeah, so that's true. So, and what you just mentioned, right? The fact that these two worlds or there is this whole workforce of people who need to upgrade their skills rapidly, if not on a regular basis, to adapt to the new age. So I think that's what you guys are able to do, right? So going down further, since we are talking about how you're selective of your speaker set, I know it's a bit of notoriety that you have in terms of how a lot of people who do want to get speaking slots don't end up getting it. How do you handle that? And do you have hate emails coming your way?
Well,
I can.
Well, we have not as many as it might appear to be. There'll be sob emails, there'll be hate emails, and then there'll be converts over a period of time who'll say, "Oh, good that you kind of put us through this process." But it's kind of evolved, and it's evolved with collaborators. So the way the system really works is that internally at HasGeek we call ourselves the process. The people who are kind of obsessed with the process, and our goal is to kind of keep the process going. And externally, what we do have are people from the community who become what we call editors. These are people who understand both community and conferences, which means that they need to be very good with their own craft, but they also need to understand that, how do you produce social experiences within a framework of knowledge.
Right.
So we handpick these people, typically 4 people, and the rule is nobody repeats after 3 years. Typically we eliminate our editors even by the end of second year, because we don't want tyrannies to be, and we don't want tyrannies, and we don't want somebody's perspective to become so dominant that we ourselves are kind of swayed about it. So we have to kind of keep doing that neutrality check constantly, like internally and externally. We moved from a system of getting people to vote on topics that they'd like to hear to a system which got extremely curated with like reviewers and with these practitioners coming into the picture, and then getting people to submit slides even before they actually were confirmed to speak. And it's been an arduous process, and I think the one thing that people do kind of thank us who've gone through a process, saying that you actually got us to rehearse, you got us to kind of like do the whole drill, so that we were kind of polished on the stage. What we're now trying to do differently is to say that instead of kind of eliminating a large set, can we now start to recognize what each person's strengths are, and then to kind of move them and filter them to different platforms. So we recognize that some people are really good at being able to hold an audience together for 40 minutes, but they're not necessarily the best people to hold an audience together for 3 hours or 6 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So our goal now becomes to literally like profile people also on the basis of what their instructional styles are, what their interpersonal skill sets are. Somebody's got very good, if somebody has extremely good domain knowledge or has extremely good process knowledge, but can't hold an audience on stage for 45 minutes, but can have a great conversation, or can we sort of like create a format for this person to come into the picture? And I think the other thing that we've also started doing is to kind of go back and talk to some of our customers and say, hey, why don't we help coach your workforce and get them to be able to tell those stories for themselves? Either tell them visually, either tell them orally, either tell them in terms of writing. So what we've now recognized is that we're in this business of creating this pipeline, because I think the fact that I still feel very proud about is, we're not in the business of kind of creating these repeatable superstars, but we're in the business of producing these superstars who are unknown, and these unknown faces who kind of get a chance to kind of present what they're actually working on. So in that sense, it's also a sense of empowerment that somebody who actually comes up on stage or who has this opportunity to kind of interact can also then think about growing at different levels of aspiration and personal growth.
Right.
So,
And obviously they might just go do that elsewhere, globally or wherever else, right?
Yeah.
They'll become advocates for whatever subject they're speaking on.
Yep.
So awesome, that's great. So, and the fact that you've been able to maintain that quality over the years is something I'm sure you've had to hold on to stringently.
So I think it started out with me as an individual, and now it's a matter of like, how do I now train people within my own organization to carry this forward, and and also not just within my organization, but how do I create more and more collaborators who can kind of take this approach and move forward. So it's now literally a process of like, how do you kind of push this out.
Right, and in fact, I'm going to come back and talk about how the other guys do it, because we know that there are like the number of events in the startup ecosystem has just exploded. So, but we're going to take a quick break and come back and talk about that.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you are not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The IPL's been going full bore this week, or for the last couple of weeks. If you podcast around that, we got a couple of suggestions for you. There is a new show that we've launched called What a Player. It's being hosted by Akash Mehta, the host of Varta Lab, and Siddharth Dudeja, who is a really funny stand-up comic. Also, on Cyrus Says, we've been doing this Wednesday episode called Lanso, Left Arm Not So Orthodox. On that, Cyrus is talking to a variety of different people about what happened the previous week in cricket. And if you want to get a historical perspective on what T20 cricket is and how it's come about, you might want to check out the show we did a couple of years ago called The Cricketwala Chronicles. It's hosted by Ayaz Memon, and in the first season, Ayaz examines how T20 cricket started. And speaking of the action this week, on The Seen and the Unseen, Amit Verma's guest is the economics editor of The Hindu, Pooja Mehra. The two of them talk about how the Indian economy has struggled in the past decade under two separate governments and prime ministers. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by Dhaval Kapadia, director, portfolio specialist at Morningstar. They talk about how you can assess your financial goals in the new financial year. On IVM Likes, Abhineet, Zoya, Madhuri and Radhika, the newbies, give out pop culture recommendations and later take you on a nostalgic journey of 90s pop music. Just so you know, the playlist of 90s songs that they recommended, we're going to make those available on our social media. On our Marathi podcast, Golgappa, Tripti is joined by animal whisperer Anand Shinde, who narrates fascinating stories of human-animal interaction and lays emphasis on the preservation of wildlife. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik Nagarajan is joined by media and creative consultant Ramesh Srivats. They talk about cricket, learning JavaScript, and how Ramesh rose to fame on Twitter. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
All right, welcome back, guys. So, leading off directly from where we were talking about before the break, you guys are doing such a high-quality, controlled, very focused sort of approach to the whole community building and spreading the message around various topics, right? Whereas alongside, while the ecosystem was growing since in the last 7 years, everything sort of has exploded, right? I mean, obviously you guys are at the epicenter, which is Bangalore, but even worldwide, even in the rest of the country, the startup ecosystem has obviously grown, and the number of things which have been happening around community for the ecosystem, and I'm not just saying startup per se, but entrepreneurship in general, have also come up. And a lot of these things are things which a lot of people have found genuinely valuable. I mean, we've spoken about on previous shows where, small things like Startup Saturdays or weekend huddles or small groups in
Mobile
various...
Monday.
In these various small locations have created some really nice communities and helped people get, grow their own products and startups. And but at the same time, there are these things which are super large scale, the big bad shows of the world, and I mean, it seems like a massive. The range is too huge, right? So you have those large scale commercial feeling sort of events where you probably just listen to one keynote speaker and then, I don't know, you just go for lunch.
They feel more like exhibitions than
exactly
events.
Right. And then you have the small stuff. So you have a unique positioning, but what's your take on this whole thing at large? How do you think it helps the ecosystem? What do you think is going right? What's going wrong? If we could chat about that, because there's a long way for us to go for sure.
Yeah, so I think if we take, say, payments, for instance, or if you take fintech for that matter, I think if you look at the sort of the structure of that community, it's essentially been closed, and it's been closed for various reasons. It's been closed because there are just so many regulations that require you to control your that require you to comply with how you manage your data, how you manage with your customers. Then there is a whole culture of lack of transparency and kickbacks and whatnot that have defined the way in which the fintech community has grown. And even if we kind of look at what exists currently, they're mostly like membership-driven organizations. Now, how do you make an intervention in this kind of a space? So, I mean, for us, what was important is how do you create a forum that is not run by us, but it's run by people who are interested, or rather, how do you kind of like seed a forum that then interested people can take over and run? Which doesn't mean to kind of indicate in any way that, it's not going to get, it's not going to become a replica of what already exists, but it's like, how do you kind of keep governing the culture of that without necessarily trying to govern anything else? So that's let's say that's one instance. The other is, I think we're kind of going through an interesting phase right now with respect to what's happening in general. While on the one hand, I mean, there's a whole culture of meetups that's exploded, and I was told that there are about like 10,000 groups on meetup.com from India itself. There is a culture of wanting to digest as much knowledge as there is outside, and that's also producing its own level of fatigue. But we are nowhere close to, say, the kind of ecosystem with the tech ecosystem that we had, say, in the US, where there is a genuine culture of saying, hey, you know what, if you belong to organization XYZ and you're facing this problem, why don't I come and tell you how I solved it in my organization? Or why don't I actually like go hands-on and help you to kind of, solve it? And I think what's missing, unfortunately, in this country right now is this culture of collaboration, which I don't think anybody is solving at this point in time. So let's take the example of, say, logistics. I was talking to someone saying that, hey, we should kind of have a gathering of, now that there are so many organizations doing logistics in all forms. You're doing artificial intelligence in logistics, you're delivering food with logistics, you're delivering, I don't know, band-aids and medicines with logistics. The point is, what is in it for all of us to come together? And I think one of our collaborators very beautifully put it down and said that, hey, listen, at the end of the day, when it comes to logistics, we all need to get together and say, hey, we need to solve the city's problems together, or we need to solve this country's problem together. If we have to kind of expedite deliveries, or if we have to kind of be able to deal with emergencies or whatnot. So I think that culture of collaboration is not something that any one of us at this point is paying attention to. The other interesting thing that I've kind of also noticed is, and this is because we started having this discussion at HasGeek last year. We actually started talking to people and saying, hey, while we're all kind of on this bandwagon of saying big data and machine learning and, understanding data footprints better and better, are we starting to look at the question of ethics, which the US is now looking at this point?
Right.
And the more I think about it, the more I recognize that the very people who talk about these ethics questions are still Americans at our conferences. And I just can't do anything about that reality, because the American society has recognized that these values are important. The Indian society is still
hasn't
not.
Yet. I mean, you guys, the whole net neutrality effort, right, when it happened here. Someone had to sort of take that philosophical leadership stance.
So I think there's been there's no doubt that there's been a great momentum in this country thanks to a lot of communities that have come together to do different kinds of things for the startup ecosystem, for technology or whatnot. But I think what we need to now fundamentally start focusing on is, how do we get this culture of collaboration in place? How do we get this culture of sharing in place? And how do we get this culture of introspection on our own values in place? Because otherwise, we're probably going to create a future that somebody else has gone through, and history will just repeat itself.
Yeah, and in fact, on the point of the, how having a overarching larger vision and having collaboration as an effort to achieve that, I think that's also something which not most people don't, talk about. Our culture typically has been that we are very short-term thinkers. And that's a problem with a lot of founders or of teams and so on also, right? Everyone's looking at just the near-term goals. To be honest, not everyone can even...
It's tough to
be able to put yourself out there and have a very large overarching goal, right? It's not easy.
And I think this is where it kind of helps to... and I can't say this with a lot of pride, because I think for us also it's been an accident that, just recognizing like what produces collaboration. So, we've seen there's been a whole wave of saying, let's do hackathons, because hackathons help us to solve problems. They help us to hire people. Well, they don't help you to do any of these things, by the way. But,
really? Is that what the data says?
But the reality is like, when we started doing hack nights, we said, hey, you know what? We don't want to have any of these competitions. What we just want to do is, if there's something new and people are interested, can we just bring people together and do this? So I remember the time when Aaron Schwartz died, and we did a hack night saying that, Aaron Schwartz was this very passionate advocate of opening up data. Can we just look at open data sets and do something? And what we've kind of realized is, like, small acts just make you come together. Like the act of saying that, hey, you know what, there is no ready-made tea. You have to go make chai yourself at 12 o'clock in the night. The infrastructure for making the chai is all available out there. And we find just the fact of like strangers coming in the kitchen and saying, hey, you know what, even I want to have a cup of chai, is suddenly the point of conversation starter. And then, hey, so what are you working on? Hey, so what are you working on? Hey, you know what, I think I know something that you are probably missing in this piece of puzzle. Let me help you. And I think we found this over and over again, that just with groups of like 30 people and 60 people, we found that people who were absolute strangers have suddenly gone back the next day and said, hey, you know what, I suddenly met this person because he had this piece of knowledge which I didn't have.
Of course. And, that serendipity is the biggest
and I think
gain from
the
that.
question now is, how do you do this on a regular basis? And part of it has to do with the fact of also saying that, are we here to kind of like compete, or are we here to kind of just open up, or just open up the box for all of us, because there is really this big black box out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, competition is also not a zero-sum game in that sense, right? I mean, in some ways, by sharing is a way to compete, right? I mean, you might be competing with different people in different contexts, but by sharing, you're being able to pull in a lot of knowledge in your own. You're giving out knowledge, but you're also pulling in knowledge.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, I mean, even if I look back on HasGeek's history, I must sort of credit the founding teams at Flipkart, where I recognize that the amount of involvement and effort they put into kind of build open source and then come out all guns blazing to kind of share it with the community. And I mean, their departure in 2015 is now sort of left a glut in the ecosystem in that sense, saying, hey, you know what? Now everybody's talking about closed pieces. Oh, we don't want to share knowledge here. We don't want to share knowledge there. Just the presence of one ecosystem player suddenly made such a big difference in the initial years, and the departure of that player has left such a big gap. And now, how do you fill it? So I think it's interesting times that we are living in right now.
Okay, so obviously Flipkart, it's a great example, right? Because they were early on one of the large startups which were rapidly growing. They sort of held the flag up for everyone else, especially Bangalore, I would say, to build that entire geek ecosystem around it. Obviously, they've had their own change of journeys and so on. And there are many others who have started and created small communities nonetheless. But overall, the ecosystem is going towards maturity, right?
Yes, and I think there is introspection, there is realization, and there is also recognition that there are gaps that we don't know enough, and how do we now learn from each other? And I think that's where people are at this point.
Yeah.
So, for instance, we know definitely in the data ecosystem, there's a clear realization that this is a fairly complex journey. You can't just say, hey, tomorrow I'm going to switch to a data science. I'm going to switch my company to a data-driven decision-making culture. Here, it doesn't happen that way.
Right.
You have to align people, you have to align processes, you have to align messiness, you have to figure out, where do you even begin? And there's a clear recognition in the community that this is a complex journey and we don't have all the answers. And it's a great starting place in that sense.
Yeah. Oh, then there are a lot of these hype cycles which people tend to latch onto, right? I think data science is the
Have you had a
one.
food tech conference? I'm sorry. I should joke about that.
Did we eat food?
So, I mean, I actually want to jump in and take a question from some folks on the Slack channel. And in fact, Ankur, who's been one of our past guests and has been himself really involved in the whole community building aspect.
He did a lot of event stuff, right? He interned at a bunch of places and he done a ton of stuff like that.
So he's actually asking, so what would it take to have a decent tech ecosystem in Mumbai? So you're actually here today, and you mentioned that it is even today, after 7 years of startups being around, startups from Bombay being around, Bangalore being around, it's still different. People see and perceive things differently, comprehend them differently. So somehow it's believed that, continuing on the question, somehow it's believed that the most action is in Delhi and Bangalore, and companies need to move to Bangalore to scale. Is this true, partially true? What's your perspective?
So I think this question could be answered in multiple ways, but while I was listening to Ankur's question, it struck me back in 2013. We had Robert Nyman, who was at that time an evangelist with Mozilla, who came down.
I think I remember this. Yeah.
And I think Nyman made a really interesting point, and he said we all need to learn from our local contexts. And now when I think about it, he didn't just mean in terms of saying white people need to learn from their white context and the Asians need to learn from the Asian context. I think Bangalore needs to learn from Bangalore's context and Bombay needs to learn from Bombay's context. And I'm not saying this superficially. I'm saying this in a real sense, in the sense that having done all of this in Bangalore for 7 years and then suddenly stepping out of Bangalore and saying, hey, can we just take a look at the world outside of Bangalore? And you discover that Pune's problems are fairly unique. Bombay's problems are fairly different. And in fact, we recently conducted an event on helping people to kind of grasp the basics in math and stats and machine learning. And later on, when we were speaking to some of the participants afterwards and said, were your expectations fulfilled? Why did you come here in the first place? We found people asking us this question, saying, can you tell us if this is really hype or not, this data science that's going on? And we were like, yeah, we are accountable to answer that question. Somebody comes and says, hey, you know what, I'm building stuff for small and medium enterprises and I need to understand how image recognition learns. That's reality outside of Bangalore. Everybody doesn't have AWS, everybody doesn't have Amazon's problems or Walmart's problems. They have problems of small and medium enterprise traders. So I think what's happened, unfortunately, and I think Kiran put this very beautifully once, where he said that Delhi has all the media and Bangalore has all the VC money, and unfortunately, what's happening is that the picture that's coming out in newspapers and whatever people consume as news and information is primarily that of like, okay, so who got funded, who went bust, who went boom.
Yeah, that's...
And that has kind of like warped realities for us. And I think the exercise that my colleagues and I have started undertaking by just moving out of Bangalore since September and, either doing events in other cities or like just talking to people in other cities, kind of making us realize that there are very different processes in play. There are different economies in play also in different cities. So let's take a couple of examples. One is how are organizations structured, and depending on, is the organization product driven, is it technology driven, is it like in HasGeek's case, while I was running it was editorially driven, and suddenly we realized, hey, sorry, we did it all wrong and now we have to change course altogether. So I think to answer Ankur's questions, one is we've got to now start paying attention to how organizations themselves are kind of are developing. We know that startups are known to be chaotic. We know that the culture of a startup is defined by the culture of its founders. And at the same time, what we're also recognizing in the 7-year journey is that organizations have undergone a lot of changes, and there's constantly the sense of upheaval of how do you align your people, your vision, your technology, and get it all going together, and that is the big struggle. And those struggles are kind of different in different parts of the country. So while I was talking to the nice folks at Book My Show today, I recognize that there is a very strong focus on there's a very strong focus on product, a very strong focus on people, which is so different in Bangalore's case, where
Really?
where in Bangalore's case the focus is how do you get the skill so that we can get onto the fast moving pace. Now these could be just unique examples that I'm throwing up over here, but I think if one were to kind of like just sit back and literally study these ecosystems, what we recognize is that there are different imperatives and push and pull factors in all of these. So in Bangalore, there's always this push and pull of like, are we moving fast or not? And there's among founders also, I think the ones who've kind of like, given it to serendipity and realized that, hey, you know what, going fast is not always the answer to the problem. But at the same time, we're living in these worlds. And the whole, going fast versus going slow also leads you to kind of then make decisions about what are you taking on? Are you going to take on to hype, or are you going to take on to reality? Are you going to take on to just getting skill sets from the outside? Are you going to grow your talent pool organically? And I think those stories of organizations have to come out. And those are interesting stories in different parts of the country. Like I was just mentioning to you, like talking to a bunch of organizations in Delhi, we realized like their biggest pain in life is how do I reduce my billings for the cloud servers that I'm running? And that's a different reality as against the reality of Bombay, which is, hey, I don't have the talent, but I have to be able to scale fast with just like 2 and 3 people in my infrastructure team.
Yeah, so it's what they value.
Is it a question of value? Is it a question of what is the environment offering to you, and therefore how are you navigating around it? I think there are these push and pull factors, and I don't mean to kind of glorify the fact that it's a complex picture, but it is a complex picture at this point in time, and different organizations are solving it in their own ways. And I guess that's also what is leading us to this interesting moment right now, where you have say banks and you have large enterprises who are suddenly saying, hey, we want to learn how these startups are doing it right now, although these have had strong organizational processes. Now the question is, how are these worlds going to interact with each other? Is this going to be like suddenly, is a large organization going to become as chaotic as a startup? No, it can't necessarily be.
Yeah.
But
I really doubt that's going to happen.
Yeah, but then the question is, how do you kind of move on to becoming agile? And where is the answer to that question? So I think the answer to Ankur's question is, we really have to now start becoming cognizant of the push and pull factors outside of what the media is showing to us, outside of this whole glorification of founders and glorification of boom and bust.
And the fact that Bangalore is this only place where you can do a startup. No, it's not.
Well, it's not. But at the same time, I think there is a reality. I mean, there is a reality that is there in Bangalore, which is that people are getting more and more onto this entrepreneurial bandwagon. And it's so easy. All you have to do is find that one person who will buy that vision with you. And, in terms of the infrastructure, well, I can start it up in my house. I can, now there are dime a dozen organizations that can register you as a private limited, as a limited liability partnership. So
and
even
there's co-working, which is...
and then there's co-working space. And hey, you know what? We've got these great cafes in Bangalore. So suddenly I walk into a cafe the other day and there's this person who says, oh, I've been trying to do the startup for 2 years and I'm sitting here and like writing my code. And,
for 2 years, he's sitting in a cafe writing code. That's amazing.
And the wherewithal is all there. I guess there's also this interesting journey that we are seeing where individuals who are talented, who are smart, are suddenly kind of feeling bored in organizations and saying, hey, I've got some backup. I've got some capital that can keep me going for a year. Can I try this out?
Yeah.
And is that happening in Bombay? I don't know the story yet. Is that happening in Delhi? I don't know the story yet. But in Bangalore, this is what is happening.
It is. It's just, but probably my perspective on this is that this happens everywhere. But the support systems may be a little more feasible in Bangalore, right? So if you want a year's worth of capital to sort of live a year in Bangalore versus to live a year in Bombay is different in absolute terms.
And also the fact that, whether we like it or not, the technology ecosystem is there right now, in the sense that the techies are there. And
you can walk down to a chaiwala and say JavaScript.
And the fellow will show you his website.
And there'll be a show of hands.
But even, I think again, I'm not that familiar with Bangalore, right? But just the sense of entrepreneurial community and camaraderie and stuff like that, right? I've recently met a lot of people. Since we started doing this show particularly, I met a lot of these, the entrepreneurs and stuff like that. But unless you're really into, going to all the events all over the place and stuff like that, it's a little difficult in Bombay to kind of meet people like that. I'm not a non-social person. I'm not a person who doesn't who shies away from stuff or anything like that. But I really didn't know that many technology entrepreneurs. I knew a lot of people in different spaces, if you will, right? But I didn't know that many technology entrepreneurs until we started doing the show.
Yeah, there are those of us who are there, and then there's Bangalore has a bunch of more of them. I think that's what it is.
No, but I think just Bangalore, it feels like there is more kind of...
there's more opportunity to meet. And I think you're right in that sense that there's more opportunity to meet. And again, that's kind of fueled by the fact that there are more and more people coming in. And there are... so I think, it's an interesting chicken and egg situation. But it is there in Bangalore. And it's not there in Bombay. And I kind of hear that sentiment not just from you, but from others saying, hey, where do I go? Where do I go to meet like-minded people? So when we recently hired somebody, he said, hey, the reason I left Delhi and came to Bangalore was because in spite of me saying, hey, I will pay money to go to an event where I can meet like-minded people, there's just no opportunity, there's just no forum for me to do it.
Yeah, but you have to also go find it.
You have to go find it. I understand you have to go find it, but from a purely, like this, it's not like we have time to spare.
Come on, you think so? Okay, if you're an aspiring entrepreneur in Bombay versus one in Bangalore, is it the guy in Bangalore can just walk up to Sachin Bansal's office and say, hey,
of course not.
hang with me?
But the guy in Bangalore has Zainab putting together events where he can go and meet other people of that nature. How many of these kinds of events are there?
Which I agree. If you look at, for instance, an organization that did an event in Bangalore, they were Delhi-based and they did a big data event in Bangalore. What prevented you from doing it in Delhi?
It's true.
You just didn't back so because the market is there.
That's audience. In fact, that's I thought I'll ask you this earlier because before your HasGeek life, you mentioned that you were into something called ethnography, and now you're sort of back to doing that, right?
Yeah, I think it's becoming a crazy project where for the past 3 months, it's just been going and talking to anybody and everybody who's been associated with technology in one way or the other and say, just tell me your life story. I just want to understand what's going on.
Hey, that's what I do at the show. That's what I do here too. So am I an ethnographer?
Apparently, Shiladitya ethnographer.
Wow. What does ethnography even mean?
Well, I actually started off my career as an ethnographer without realizing one. I wrote out this crazy research proposal to this very nice institution, which unfortunately doesn't exist today. And I said, just give me some money for 6 months to study women as they are in the ladies' compartment in Bombay's local trains. And they said, sounds very interesting. Here, take some 6 months of survival money and do the study.
They did that. Amazing.
I think it's amazing because, part of what I'm doing in HasGeek right now is also as a result of the fact that I, in my time between 2001 and 2007, we had the luxury of this kind of an institution that said, hey, research doesn't have to be the way it is taught in universities. Anybody can be a researcher. You can be a filmmaker and you can be a researcher. You can be an artist and you can be a researcher. And we will help you to do your research by letting you, giving you some seed money for your crazy ideas. And I think part of this whole, this drive in HasGeek to say that, we're going to get practitioners to talk to practitioners also comes from this sort of background that I had, which is that, let practitioners talk to practitioners and learn things in an interdisciplinary manner. But but my life as an ethnographer really started with looking at women in local trains and just being appalled by the fact that, why are they fighting over space?
And now it's come back to understanding why does Bangalore and Bombay have different
and now
kinds
it's
of
like
people.
let us look at the cats in their natural environment.
Yep.
And what makes them Persian cats? So what makes the developer such a prized commodity, if you may? So I think that's an exercise that my colleagues and I have been undertaking, and I've been forcing on my colleagues and say, let us listen to everybody, because our customers are our window to the world. They're not just the world to us.
Nice.
And it's interesting how the perspectives are opening up. The recognition, which you very rightly, bingo, like you pointed out, saying, here are people who've undertaken these journeys by themselves because there's no institutional structure to support it. I mean, you have to be able to peel all the layers of the onion and, figure out, whether you're going to end up with tears or whether you're going to end up with something fantastic. And we're discovering these journeys are just getting they're getting so complexly interdisciplinary. I met somebody who said he was into forestry in Orissa, who was doing open source in order to be able to produce forestry designs, and then got discovered by somebody in Bangalore and said, hey, why don't you come here? And now he's become one of the contributors to the whole React Native project. Hello, that's a story.
That is, yeah.
That is quite a story. And, just now trying to understand how people are going through these journeys and what is the roadmap for the next generation, because clearly there's no educational institution that's going to provide you with that roadmap. Who's going to provide you with that roadmap? I don't know. So I think, it's really interesting that, people that we knew in the last 7 years, the way we kind of understood our audience in the last 7 years has now changed. The world has moved on. We're recognizing that skills are becoming more and more precious. There is an increasing trend towards generalization because everybody has to double down on 2 or 3 roles. Mm-hmm. Hey, you're not just a front end developer. You have to move towards becoming a full stack developer.
Yeah.
Whether that's a good thing or not, we don't know. But more, and then at the same time, you're watching that technology itself is getting commoditized. So what were originally or what were earlier capabilities that only data scientists could roll out are suddenly capabilities that the cloud can give you. And all you have to do is to put pieces together and bingo, you're on.
Let's hope it's that simple, but it's not.
It's not. Yes, not. You're right, it's not. And I think then this question really is that, what happens to some of those people with specific skill sets and what happens to people with skill sets that were valued, but then these are not necessarily programmers.
So what are your COBOL friends doing these days?
They had to go learn Java.
Okay.
And
the Java guys are now learning JavaScript.
Yeah. Pretty much.
And then I'm spending my time telling HR people from companies that Java and JavaScript are not cousin sisters.
Yeah. Not at all, by the way. Yeah. But awesome. I think wow, that hour almost went away, flew by, and thanks so much for doing this, Zainab. I think we have a whole lot more conversation pending, which we will hope to take on to the Slack channel and also on Twitter. We can find you on Twitter on @Zainab Bawa.
Yes.
And of course, at any of the conferences at HasGeek. Yes. And if you're lucky enough, you might even be a speaker.
All right. And everybody, please remember to subscribe to the Slack channel. Go to the website, rvmpodcast.com/Shunya One. Over there's a button where you can request the invitation. Please do that, and we'll send across an invitation. And also, please do the reviews on iTunes. I am really disappointed in the fact that not enough of you are doing that. Please, more people do it. 5-star reviews, and we'll make Shiladitya wear a funny hat and take pictures and put them online.
All right. Thank you. That I'm sure that's going to happen one day. Thanks so much, guys, and we'll talk to you next week.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
How aware do you think you are of your laws and rights? Do you look up to laws when you are caught up in situations? Do you know what your rights are when you're stuck somewhere bad? Well, here's a show that can help you move an inch closer to being aware of what your rights are. Tune into Know Your Qanoon with me, Amar Rana. This is a podcast meant to answer all your law-related queries. Catch Know Your Qanoon every week on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.